please do feel free to share this live chat on your page. This is our first one, so we're really excited about that. I'm Marianna Islam, and you are?
Hi, everyone. I'm Edgar Villanueva, and we are with the Schott Foundation for Public Education. Really excited about everyone joining us today for a special conversation on this National Day of Racial Healing about decolonizing wealth.
So when Edgar and I were thinking about this, we were thinking, what could we do to contribute to the conversation happening nationally in light of this National Day of Racial Healing that has been launched by the Kellogg Foundation. It was pretty natural. I have a boss who is brilliant, and he came out with this amazing book. And we often have, and I have the, I think, privilege and experience of, talking with him on a regular basis and really hearing his thought leadership. And we thought, well, let's have a conversation that we normally do, but let's share it with the wider audience. Edgar in particular has been speaking, in numerous events, philanthropic events, and we wanted to invite folks to join us for a more broader conversation about his book and about, really this moment. This movement moment that we're all experiencing. And so we definitely want to have a real talk, but maybe not as raw as we normally do. And, as two folks of color who grew up in working poor families, who somehow found ourselves, working in this field that, along with government and the social sector decides, who should hold power in our communities. It's just amazing. Like, I wake up every day thinking, like, how the heck did I get here? So let's start there. So Edgar, tell us a little bit more about, your journey. What does it mean to be a philanthropist, and can anyone be a philanthropist? And how does that contribute to racial healing?
Absolutely. So, when we hear the word philanthropist, I think people often first think of the Rockefellers and the Fords and the Carnegies. The truth is that we, people of color, were the first philanthropists. I write in my book that the first philanthropist that I ever knew was actually my mom. We were obviously not wealthy. We didn't come from wealth. We didn't have a foundation. But the spirit of generosity that exists in our culture back home in North Carolina, I'm a member of the Lumbee tribe. And I know that there's a culture of generosity and giving that exists in many cultures of color. And so first and foremost, that I lift us up as really being the true philanthropists that take care of each other and of community. And so my path and experience working in institutional philanthropy as a person of color has been really interesting, lots of ups and downs, because I think that this space was not created for people like us to survive or to thrive. And I do feel on one hand very fortunate to have had the opportunity, but philanthropy has let me know that. They have let me know that I am lucky to have these jobs. The moment that I'm, want to leave, there are thousands who would want to take my place. And I don't take that for granted. I do think it's a privilege to do this work, but at the same time, I think we have a lot of work to do for philanthropy, for the nonprofit sector in general, to really reach a place that they truly appreciate the gifts that we have to bring as people of color to the workplace. And, I celebrate the progress that we've made on today, this day of racial healing, but also acknowledging that there's a lot of work ahead to really achieve equity in our sector.
Yeah, we're also sharing this talk because I think, as Edgar alluded to, we're two folks of color who work in a field that's largely underrepresented by people of color. And so racial healing for us is a daily practice. It's something that I know we both talk explicitly with each other about our experiences and strategizing, like how to navigate in this space, which is part of the work, but it's also part of our own, I think, healing. So, but you ultimately wrote this book that is being discussed widely in the field. How has that contributed to your own racial healing, and what is particularly important for you to share with everyday people who don't necessarily consider themselves to be in philanthropy?
Yeah, so writing this book was absolutely medicine for me. For a long time, I think I held in traumatic experiences or feelings of being re-traumatized by working in environments that had super white dominant cultures, who in different ways reminded me on a daily basis that I did not belong, as a person of color and as a person who comes from a poor community. And so I've seen inside of philanthropy and institutions that have extreme wealth and privilege, how folks like me can either sort of learn to thrive and adapt and assimilate to do the work of trying to move resources to our communities. But I've also seen the ugly side of internalized oppression, where folks kind of sell out, or because of the scarcity mentality, or because of tokenism, where only a few of us are allowed in the space, we actually take on the behavior of the oppressor and treat each other very ugly. And so I was really fortunate with this book to be able to stop, to reflect on all of these different experiences, and then to seek refuge and wisdom from many people in this work who have been doing this work for a long time. Also just, movement leaders and indigenous elders who I sit with to really sort of ask the question, what is philanthropy really all about? What is the net value of it? And how do we as people of color, as indigenous people, how do we really understand philanthropy and taking care of one another and being in community? And so for me, this process allowed me to just really heal, by telling the story and putting the truth out there, because it is truth and reconciliation is really what would set you free. And at the same time, to remember who I was and what made me strong, and the wisdom and the way of being and existing as a leader that is in my DNA, and to remember that and to tap into that. And then that became for me what the message of this book is really all about, that there is an inherent wisdom that exists in indigenous communities that has always been there. We have always been open source people who have accepted people into our communities, who have loved generously, who have given, who have provided for each other and for strangers. That type of way of existing, that native worldview, is something that I bring and share with all of us as a way forward to really begin to bridge divides that exist in this country.
Mm. You hit on a lot of stuff, and I wish we could, have a little bit of more time to go deeper in all of it. But some of the things I just want to highlight is, and I should have highlighted it from your first response, which is we are all philanthropists. So I think everyone who's joining this, hopefully that resonates with you, and sinks in, is that we are all philanthropists in this work. And just because somebody has more accumulated wealth than you does not necessarily dismiss your contribution, right, to society and to humanity. And then, you touch on some other points that often come up for us around internalized racism, tokenism, and these are all incredibly important things for us as people of color to deeply interrogate in our work, because yes, we find ourselves lifted up in these positions and in these roles, but it's so important not to do that alone without building some sort of collective capacity and community around our work. And so just wondering from you, like, right, well, we talk about this regularly, like how we do that, but like if you could talk a little bit about how critically important that aspect of it is, that we cannot just sit in these on these platforms and lead the work, but we have to find ways to do that in concert with community.
Yeah, it's really easy, especially on, like, over the past couple of days, right? There's been marches in DC. Yesterday was MLK Day. So it's really easy to jump on the bandwagon and put a quote on your Facebook, right, that is about justice. But when we really began thinking about how do we live and operationalize those types of values in our work, it's really challenging. The truth is, it's often challenging. And so where do we start? How do we actually begin to practice in the workplace, especially in philanthropy and the nonprofit sector? What I always say to folks is begin by holding up a mirror. You know, take a deep gaze into the mirror and ask yourself, how are you perpetuating, you know, the dynamics of colonization in your work, which that's like a big question. So to break that down a little bit more, all of us have biases. We all sort of give in, I think, to different ways of the mainstream way of doing things because that's just the way it is, or those are the rules or the policies. But if we were really able to step back and examine our work and to see, you know, what are the ways in every decision point in our organizations, there are ways to be more equitable. Whether you are the front desk receptionist in an organization, how you treat people when they walk in the door, who you choose to sort of prioritize in the process to get a meeting with someone or whatever, we all hold a certain amount of power, and there are opportunities to do work in a way that is actually more equitable. I think the challenge for philanthropy, especially when we think about equity and operationalizing this in our work, is that we don't quite understand what equity actually means. We throw that word around quite a bit these days, and I'm thankful that we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. But we often, I think, are thinking of equality as a mindset that, you know, of course, it makes sense that we all should be treated equally and should have the same kind of opportunity, and that's a good thing. But when we really think about equity, equity is a power shift. It's a change in ownership. And so to really operationalize equity in our work as funders or nonprofit leaders, we have to think about what does that mean to actually step back. If you're a person who has been privileged and has held power, it means that you actually have to take a step back and have less power. It means that others who have been marginalized have to be given more power. And so for those of you who have been privileged, when you begin to operationalize equity in your work, it may actually feel like oppression for you because you're used to having a certain amount of power. And so those are the real conversations where the rubber meets the road that I put out as a challenge for us to think about. What are you really willing to give up and to have less than of in order for others to have more power and more say so and more voice, however you want to frame that.
Mm. And, you know, because we're connecting this to also conversations around racial healing and whatever definition we hold around healing, I think there's a piece of it that's really around repairing the harm that's been caused, right? And so you also brought up, I think, an important point around situational privilege and power that I think needs to be lifted up in this conversation. And so you and I, at in certain places, hold that, right? Situational power and privilege, right? Just by being a decision maker in philanthropy, you know, myself being a heterosexual woman, and then also being South Asian. You know, I think it challenges us to really think about how do we give up space and resources to folks who are more marginalized and need to be centered in the work. But how can that be a healing practice for privileged groups like, you know, the ones that we can be in?
Yeah, you know, I think that all of us, I mean, when we go back to the idea of holding up a mirror, one of the things that we need to all identify is that we all have trauma. Mm-hmm. Whether your trauma is a result of colonization or exploitation or suffering that you may have experienced because of being an immigrant, you know, to this country, because of our unfair policies and sort of systems and policies of racism in this country. So we all have trauma that shows up in different ways. Also, you know, I think that privileged white folks need to also see that they have trauma. I think that's something that even for us enlightened ones, we often don't realize that anyone who is subscribing to a false notion of white supremacy, anyone who really believes that is traumatized. We have been conditioned in this country to believe something that is not real, that white is better, that white is supreme. And so subscribing to that false idea of what it means to be an American for some people has actually caused loss and trauma. And when you look back far enough in everyone's community, at one point you will see that many of us, most of us, or all of us came from communities that were very tribal and communal and very connected. But yet we've assimilated in this country to ideas of being individuals and being disconnected, and sort of the idea of the American dream, which is built around competition versus cooperation and being in that communal type of relationship with one another. And so that, again, the result of that is trauma. And I think what we're seeing now under this administration and the horrific acts of hate and white supremacy that are popping off around the country, is a result of pain that people have deep down inside because they have actually believed a lie. And so recognizing that and coming to terms with the trauma that we all share, I believe can be a starting point. If we're all traumatized, then we can all find a way to collectively heal. And so your healing journey may be different from mine, but healing is something that's required of all of us. And it begins with one identifying what that pain is, right? So just like if you go to the doctor, you're sick, there might be symptoms there. We're seeing symptoms, but we got to get to the root of what the problem really is, and what the trauma really is, so that we can get really on a right path of healing for our prospective communities.
Right. And healing doesn't necessarily have to always be a painful process, right? It can be a joyful one. I know oftentimes we laugh, we snicker, and we do all of that in our work, right? Because just to get through the day, right? Or just to get through something. But I also think the practice of giving up power and privilege can be a joyful one. It can be painful initially, right? Because something's got to change, right? You have to give up something to hold space for others or provide, support to others. And I found, in my work, supporting and centering the voices of Black women, I become joyful seeing Black women lead and seeing Black women win. Like that's, for me, it's been such an incredibly spiritual practice, right? For me, it's really driven by a deep sense of humanity and compassion for others. And so this idea that it has to be a painful process really comes from, I think, the way that we have been, institutionalized into thinking about, what that looks and feels like, right? And so,
Exactly.
It's always a call to action to South Asian folks and to Asian and, white folks about how important it is, I think, for us to take that spiritual journey and look for ways that we can, bring more compassion and decolonization, right, into this work, as you say. So let's talk about something that's just been, going viral, right? It's this 10-year social media challenge that, folks have put out. So you take you put up your picture from 10 years ago and a picture of where you are now, or who you are now. And, some folks have, rightfully so, I think, criticized that whole challenge being, ableist and, ageist and transphobic and all of that. But I've seen some really creative ways people have been responding to that challenge. And so Joanne Smith from GGE put up, movement, a 10-year movement challenge. What did movement look like for you 10 years ago, and what does it look like today? And I think ultimately her photo was of Auntie Maxine Waters, which I thought was creative, right? And so I'm putting out a different challenge, which is, where were you in philanthropy 10 years ago, and really, where are you today?
Oh, well, yeah. My today self would not even know the Edgar 10 years ago. 10 years ago, I was working at a foundation in North Carolina, and I was a up and coming, a rising star, I would say, in the field, and really frustrated by and probably becoming quite disillusioned by the realities that were around me of being in an organization and a field that had a very explicit mission around change in communities, but feeling like my hands were tied to really act upon that mission. And, feeling, I think looking feeling that fear of speaking up and, your voice shaking because it's the truth and what you believe, but also feeling afraid of the consequences and what was at stake by being the person to kind of speak up. And so, you know, what we're talking about today, what has happened 10 years later in this field, because of so much work that has happened by many people to push this field, philanthropy specifically, to a place of accountability, to where it feels like we're in a day of reckoning, and wanting to really hold this field accountable to community in so many different ways is just astonishing. The fact that I wrote this book and I'm being celebrated and invited in to speak at so many conferences, and it's actually a conversation that people are ready to have, just really blows my mind. The other thing that I want to say about that, I've been thinking about this a lot lately, about, you know, and I think this is really critical to the point about racial healing. We have to have a lot of grace in the way that we interact with one another. We have to make room for people in this movement. 10 years ago, I was not as progressive as I am now. I mean, frankly, I just wasn't. I had not been exposed. My analysis was not as sharp as it should be. I was holding on to various biases, probably that had been taught to me as a product of my environment. And it takes time and exposure and education and reading and conversations for people to evolve. And so today I'm seen as a super progressive thought leader in the field. But yeah, as recent as 10 years ago, I still did not quite understand, you know, different aspects, different communities, you know, different way, you know, things that we're talking about now as a part of our liberation. And so it's been because of, you know, the patience and people have taken me under their wing and taught me and supported me in getting there to where I am today. And so a question that I have for folks is to think about in our communities, if someone showed up today and today was the first time that they were actually seeing the light or wanting to think about things differently, or no longer support a certain political party, or you know, put aside some of the biases, and they were asking for help, would we welcome them? Will we have a place for them to catch up, or will we, you know, sort of push them away or crucify them? And so I think that often that's a challenge for us who have gotten to this place, is that we can become quite self-righteous. And I left North Carolina and moved to Seattle. So a very conservative place, so a very progressive place. And living in that progressive place, I often felt sort of as an outsider trying to find my way and fit in, because there was such an elitism and an intellectualism around the politic there that is a good politic, but yet if we're not able to connect at the heart and meet people where they are and bring people in, then we're not going to make progress in this country in terms of, you know, coming back together as one community.
That's really, I think that really resonated with me deeply, because that's something, to be honest with you, I'm actually still working on, is that emergent strategy sort of approach, and thinking of, you know, of abundance in our work, right? That there is space to, you know, bring on others. And also thinking about that in my elder sort of auntie role, right? And feeling like, yeah, like 10 years ago, oh my goodness, like I would not be, you know, upset if somebody pulled me to a corner and like really checked me, right? Because I think I was coming in with sort of this bright, wide-eyed, really look at the world, and dismissing sort of the harsh realities and experiences of others who've come before me. But if it wasn't for people in the community holding me and holding, you know, space for me to act out my foolishness, not really, I mean, like really, like, you know, challenging me in my thinking and my ways, you know, I wouldn't have evolved. And so how important that is. So, so I hear that challenge and that question that you put out there for everyone. And I think it's a great one as well. So you have actually developed a series of steps that folks could take, right? Because healing is an action, it's a verb, right? And when you're talking about decolonizing wealth, and what does that look like? What are the steps that people should take?
So we don't have time to go through all of them today, but, you know, essentially to develop the steps, I when I pulled steps from my own personal experience, I also looked at indigenous models of restorative justice, right? So healing in many ways is a restorative justice process. And restorative justice was adapted from indigenous communities. That's a whole nother conversation there. But looking at the steps, they are grieve, apologize, listen, relate, represent, invest, and repair. And so I adapted these steps to foundations and financial institutions, organizations that move and control capital. And, you know, part of what's interesting when you think about healing, I kind of went back and forth with the publisher around this book being a little heavy on the problem side and them wanting more on the solution side. It was really hard to get a 50-50 balance, which is kind of what you strive for in a book. You kind of talk about a problem, and then you talk about your solution, because a major part of healing is a process of understanding the truth. And so in the book, I give a primer on colonization and really break it down in a way that helps people understand the actual truth that we're not taught in schools, and what the long-term effects of colonization have been in indigenous communities, but all communities, including white communities again, right? So the first step to healing is actually really understanding that. And step one is grieve, which is like, as you said, healing can be fun, but there often is a grieving step in there that is not so fun, because when you come to fully understand the trauma that exists in this country as a result of our racist history, it's actually a very sad thing. Like we're not grieving around that because we know, but for folks who are really coming into a full understanding of what has happened in this country and how their family and ancestors may have been contributors to what has happened, there's often a process of grief that people experience that can be paralyzing for a while before they're able to move forward in their healing. As this applies to foundations, I think the foundations have to do the same thing, right? And nonprofit organizations, banks, financial institutions, we need to actually reflect on how we have contributed to harming communities. We in philanthropy are doing so much to try to help and to repair and to support social change. But historically, we have also been contributors to the problem. And we have to own up to that in order for us to really begin to move forward, to have a more authentic relationship with communities. And so it's kind of, you know, in this country, I think we have a tendency to not want to talk about painful situations, or even in our families, right? We sweep things under the carpet. But to really get to a place of healing, we have to just speak the truth and say, you know what, yes, I work in this institution, and historically this money was earned in a way that was harmful to communities of color. This is something that we want to acknowledge and remember as we are now moving into a place to want to heal and repair, use these resources as medicine. And so those are some of the fundamental steps of kind of just acknowledging. And then we move to a place where we apologize, which apologize is such a powerful step. In every decent society, when you do something wrong, you apologize. And so some countries have done this. Canada had a decade of truth and reconciliation where they listened to the grievances from First Nations communities, and then they actually apologize. Germany has done this for what they did to Jewish folks during World War II. And so in this country, we have never come to terms with our history, and we have yet to apologize to communities that we have harmed, to communities that provided free labor to build the wealth of this country on their back, you know, forced free labor. And so we have chosen to sort of sweep that under the carpet and to kind of move forward. And so this is why when people say, why don't you just get over it? Why can't we just move on? Mm-hmm. This is the challenge with doing that, because we want to hear an apology. We want this country to own up to its history, to what it has done to First Nations folks and to other communities of color. Hearing that apology is just so transformative for us, and would be. but it's also powerful for those who are the descendants of the perpetrators or the offenders. So I talk about the power of apologies. And so after you go through that personal process as a person or organization of grieving and apologizing, you then are in a position to turn externally and begin to build a relationship with others, to listen, to relate, to connect to others, to really begin to operationalize these concepts in your work. If you have not done the work to understand our history, to feel bad about it, to apologize, to grieve that, you're not in a position to then, launch a new equity strategy in your foundation, because you have, you know what I mean? And so it takes that deep work that is work of the heart, work of the mind. It's going to be emotional. It's going to be touchy-feely and at times uncomfortable, but that is part of the process. And the true joy comes, the joy that you talked about a minute ago, when you get to the other side of that and you know that you're in the flow and that you're in that process of healing, and you begin to see the connections being made and the community coming together, and you funding or supporting or implementing programs that are actually making a difference in the lives of people in a real way, because you're getting supporting those who are at the margins. There's no parallel to that type of joyful experience. And everyone can be a part of that if they're willing to take on a healing process.
Love it. So we are at time, but I'm hoping that we can have more pop up live conversations, and definitely, perhaps we could even talk about the various steps, sort of each step of the way, because I think these are really critical conversations. This is the work, right? This is the work that we all must do as a nation, right? This is not just foundations and philanthropy, although, that's where we're situated in the conversation, and where you're directly situated in having this conversation with so many people who have enormous wealth, right? And so, so I want to thank everybody for being with us, sticking with us through the test run of this. Hopefully, again, we'll have more conversations like this. And thank you again. And again, remember, to Edgar's point, that we're all philanthropists, right? And so we all have the power to give. And I think, that is a beautiful thing, right?
Absolutely. A few resources before you go. If you're not a member of the SHOT Foundation family, please go to our website, shotfoundation.org, and subscribe to our newsletter. That way you can stay in touch for future conversations like this and so much more that we're doing at SHOT to advance racial justice in the public education space. And the book, Decolonizing Wealth, is available everywhere books are sold, or you can check it out at decolonizingwealth.com. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Perfect. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.